Here's a loaded question. Do we have free will? Or instead, is everything in our lives, in some sense, out of our control? Many of us feel trapped between two untenable extremes. First, we might feel like helpless puppets, feeling that our genetics, our upbringing, our brain chemistry, and everything that has occurred in our past determines everything that happens to us and therefore everything that we do. We're just kind of going along for the ride. And if that's the way things are, how can we or anybody be responsible for our lives? Second, we might feel the burden of what we might term absolute freedom. This, on the other hand, is the feeling that, or even the conviction, that we have a kind of magical, unlimited freedom to do anything at all, even given all of our past causes and conditions. This, on the other hand, can lead to an intensely personal feeling of responsibility for any failures we might have. A kind of heightened anxiety that we alone are to blame when we underperform. Or, alternately, we might gain from this kind of view a grander sense of ego when we manage to succeed. The individualism of, I did it all by myself. Now, the Buddha faced a very similar debate 2,500 years ago, and his response involved what we might call a kind of middle way between these two extremes of egoistic helplessness and anxiety that is now being echoed by modern philosophers and neuroscientists. The first extreme goes by many names, including determinism, fatalism, and so on. It's basically the idea that we have no real agency in the world. We're simply carried along by the way things happen. This view is very similar to that of the Buddha's competitor, Macaulay Gosala, who is represented in the early texts as arguing, one does not act of one's own volition. One does not act of another's volition. One does not act from a person's volition. There's no power, no energy, no human strength or vigor. All sentient beings, all living creatures, all beings, all souls lack control, power, and energy. Molded by destiny, by circumstance and nature, they experience pleasure and pain in the 6 classes of rebirth. Gosala argues from this that there is no particular practice that we can undertake to change our fate. That is, we're allotted a particular measure of pleasure and pain, and there's really nothing we can do to get out of that allotment. Therefore, for Gosala, there's no real sense to be made of distinguishing between the things that we supposedly should or should not be doing. All that we do by necessity. The Buddha, on the other hand, argues that since those who follow this kind of view don't actually find that there are things that should and should not be done, they're unmindful and careless and can't rightly be called ascetics. That is, such a view, the view of Macaulay Gosala, leads to a lack of effort on the part of its believers. The second extreme that we talked about also goes by many names. In philosophy, it's known as libertarian free will. This notion that there is some core part or essence to our being that's somehow completely untouched by causes and conditions, and which therefore can act with perfect spontaneity, making itself as it wishes. The Buddha rejects a view like this in his famous second sermon on non-self, where he argues that there is no part of our self or our experience over which we have perfect control. All things that we do depend on causes and conditions. This is why all conditioned things are dukkha, or unsatisfactory. If we had the power to make things truly as we wished, we would never experience suffering. We'd be able to determine the nature of our own consciousness, of our course of action immediately. And yet, who among us has perfect control even over their own will? We know that we shouldn't eat the cake, but here we are eating it. We spend much of our lives looking back with regret on choices that we made, while knowing that those choices were unwise. So, as we've seen, the first extreme leads to a kind of inaction and despair on the part of its believers. The second extreme involves a kind of blindness as to how our minds and bodies really function. What did the Buddha suggest as an alternative to these two unpromising views? To begin with, the Buddha firmly believed in the workings of karma. Now, karma can be understood in many ways. It can be, for example, understood in a somewhat supernatural way, as leading to our destinations in future lifetimes, for instance. But as I've argued in several of my prior videos, I'll have links to those down below, first and foremost, karma is a doctrine that certain things we do reliably lead to our future benefit and the benefit of those around us, while other things that we do reliably lead to our future suffering and indeed the suffering of those around us as well. Understood in this way, the Buddhist idea of karma is a very practical, down-to-earth philosophy that there are things that we should and should not do for our benefit and the benefit of people around us. And what is the actual essence of this karma? The Buddha famously said, "It is intention that I call karma." That is, karma, this apparently weird ability that we have to affect the future, resides simply in our own intention. For, the Buddha says, having intended, one acts by way of body, speech, and mind. But that intention itself does not spring from nowhere. And where is the source of karma? Contact is its source, as the Buddha says. That is, our karma, our intention, has its source in prior contacts that we had with the world. Those contacts then flow through our intention to our bodily, verbal, and mental actions. Say we're hungry and we see some food, that we have contact, visual contact with the food. This then leads to a bodily action to go and get dinner, for example. This is the early Buddhist view of the will. It's not a kind of metaphysical soul entity that originates everything, but it's instead the sort of psychological event of intention that happens right here and now. In other words, your will is not a kind of thing that you possess, but instead a kind of process that you participate in. This reframing shifts the focus from an unanswerable kind of cosmic question, do I have free will, to a more practical and immediate one. That is, what are my intentions right now, and are they truly skillful? Contemporary scholars such as Asaf Federman have recently argued that the Buddha essentially taught what might be understood as a form of compatibilism. This is the idea that radical causal conditioning is compatible with, that is to say, can coexist with freedom. Federman points out that the Buddha rejected the Upanishadic ideas of a transcendent soul, that is an Atman, or inner controller, as it's called in the Upanishads, that stands outside of causes and effects and basically pulls the strings of what we do. This ancient idea of the inner controller is strikingly similar to modern philosopher Daniel Dennett's critique of the so-called, what he calls the Cartesian theater. This is the idea that our quote-unquote free choices are essentially made by a kind of little person, a ghost in the machine that sits inside of our heads watching the movie of our lives. But really, true freedom is not about being outside of causes and conditions. that would only leave us blind and out of touch. Instead, true freedom is about being able to respond to causes skillfully, with wisdom. It's the trained ability to pause, to reflect, and to shape our intentions based upon our prior understanding of the way things are. This, on the other hand, is a freedom that's truly worth wanting. So if our will, like indeed all things, is conditioned, how can we be free? Well, by changing the conditions. This is what we do through our practice. For example, we can take a jazz musician. They're not free simply because they can play any random note. They're free because they've practiced such things as scales and tunes from many different songs intensively over many years. They've learned these rules, these conditions, so well that they can now improvise beautifully from within that structure. Within Buddhism, these scales, these tunes that we've learned, that is our practice, is, we might say, the Eightfold Path itself. In a similar vein, a sailor cannot control the wind, but they can learn how to skillfully adjust the sails to navigate the boat where they want it to go, given how the wind is blowing. Just so, we cannot control our conditions. However, through practice, we can learn to adjust our intentions so that we aim towards our benefit and the benefit of all who surround us. The Buddhist path is a training program for our intentions. This, indeed, is mindfulness practice. We watch the wind, that is, our thoughts, feelings, and external conditions, so that we can set our internal sails more wisely. The ultimate goal here is not to prove some philosophical point or other. That was never the Buddha's aim. Instead, his aim was to alleviate suffering and experience what he called the taste of freedom. As he says, the ocean has just one taste, the taste of salt. In the same way, this teaching and training has one taste, the taste of freedom. This freedom that the Buddha talks about is the felt experience of being released from the compulsive grip of greed, of hatred, and of delusion. It's being released from the craving for that which we cannot have and the aversion towards what we cannot escape. It's true contentment, a peace that does not depend on our getting everything that we might think we want. And this freedom begins simply, with the quiet intention to act with kindness instead of anger, with generosity instead of greed. Now, the Buddha's message, therefore, is profoundly optimistic, but realistic at the same time. We are not helpless puppets of fate. Every moment holds the potential for a skillful intention that can change the course of our lives. Freedom, therefore, is not something that we have or possess. Instead, it's something that we cultivate, one moment, one intention at a time. So, my question for you is, what intention are you going to try to cultivate right here and right now? Let us know in the comments below. And if freedom is something that you cultivate, that you truly do cultivate through practice, what is that practice? Well, the Buddha's most famous answer to that question is the Noble Eightfold Path. That is the path that we cultivate, the training manual for developing this skill of freedom. And to dive into that path, I recommend that you watch my playlist on the Eightfold Path. Next, I've got a link to it right up here on the screen, and we'll see you right there afterwards. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.